the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Coming masters of war, you build the big guns, you build the death planes, you build all the bombs, you hide behind walls, you hide behind desks. I just want you to know I can see through your masks. You'd have never done nothing but build to destroy. You play with my world like it's your little toy. You put a gun in my hand, you hide from my eyes, and you turn and run farther when the fast bullets fly. Just like Judas of old, you lie and deceive. When a war can be won, you want me to believe, but I see through your eyes, and I see through your brain. I see through the water that runs down my drain. You fasten all the triggers for the others to fire. You sit back and watch while the death count gets higher. You hide in your mansion while the young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud. You've thrown the worst fear can never be hurled. Fear to bring children into the world, for threatening my baby, unborn and unnamed. You ain't worth the blood that runs through your veins. How much do I know? Talk out of turn. You might say that I'm young, you might say I'm unlearned. There's one thing I know, though I'm younger than you, even Jesus would never forgive what you do. Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could? I think you will find when your debt takes its toll, all the money you made will never buy back your soul. And I hope that you die, your death will come soon. I'll follow your casket.
Hello everyone, I am Matthew Holbert. This is On Economics, History and Moving Forward, Cloud Theory, Reciprocal Economy, and Wisdom Councils. This is, by the way, dedicated to everyone who has gone through the public education system and has come out feeling cheated, and for everybody who's gone through the financial system and feels like they can't make ends meet, or that they just don't feel like they can get by going off of the the debt-based kind of system that we have in place. And it's also for every person who has gone through the public education system and the various systems in place and has come out indoctrinated and incapable of critical or open thinking. Just as an overview, we're going to go over the history of economy, which is just resource management and human existence, human coexistence. This has sort of been in place for as long as life has been in place. So you have to make a distinction between economy and economics. Economy is just the thing in itself. Economics is the study of human coexistence and the systems we've made up to sort of do that. And then we're going to go over some definitions just to be able to get clear on what exactly, sort of what is in place at this point. And then moving forward with economic alternatives, we're going to talk about things like B corporations, which are benefit-based corporations, the cloud theory of economics, reciprocism or reciprocal economy, body-based economy, human scale economics, holism, and self-sufficient and thrival-based economy, as well as planetary organism. So, so the history of economy is really, it starts with things like barter, or basically with trade, which is just a characteristic of life. And you can also look at your own body as a perfect example of what economy really should be all about. It has your body has this homeostasis that it keeps, and that in itself is sort of something that we need to look at in order to make a more perfect system. And the money economy begins with basically civilization, with the coining of various coins, gold, silver, copper, whatever they had available to them. And it doesn't come until basically the Roman times that a law about money comes into existence, and that's maritime admiralty.
There's a Roman maximum in law that says, "For he that would be deceived, let him." Simply meaning, if you are so ignorant as to be deceived, then that's your business. You need to do your homework and find out what the words mean, especially in relation to law and government. Because there is a world of occultism that is operating today throughout the world, in which you use certain words, and when those words are used in a court, they don't mean the same thing at all. Now let me give you an example of how this law of the water works. Why is it that you have to go to court? People are always concerned about going to court. You go to court because you play basketball and tennis on a court. How do you play tennis on a court? You play with a racket. Why? Because that's what it is. It's a racket.
It doesn't come until the banking economy that we have it basically, that we see it make it rain. Because at that point, money becomes, or credit, liquidity, the ability for people to just buy things and so forth, has expanded so vastly that it becomes really like what it's all about. So we get central banks in America. The first central bank was in 1791. It lasted until 1811. And when it ended in 1811, there was a huge uproar in London because of, you can blame, actually, Alexander Hamilton was responsible primarily for creating the first national bank. And he is known in history as being a Rothschild agent or a proponent of the Rothschild dynasty. And so the War of 1812 actually started over currency because of our attempt to basically isolate ourselves from the international banking cartels. And so from there we get the second bank, which starts in 1816 due to the debt that was incurred on our colonies or on our government due to the War of 1812. So we eventually had to resort back to having another national bank or another central bank, and that was from 1816 to 1836 when Alexander Hamilton didn't renew the lease basically on that bank, and it ended up going under. And one of his legacies, actually, he died on his deathbed. His last words were, "I killed the bank." And yet it's ironic that his face is on the $20 bill, one of the most highly circulated bills in the United States economy. So Then in 1907, there was a sort of crisis, financial crisis, which led to the demand for the Federal Reserve to be set into place. And that was really, I mean, it can be shown that in 1907, that crash was really created through speculation, and it wasn't actually something that needed to happen. And so with that, Paul Warburg is known as one of the fundamental, instrumental people in creating the Federal Reserve Act. Then we go on to the history of economics, which is starts with Adam Smith, and he was around from 1723 to 1790. His first book was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. That's sort of about ethics, really, about why these systems are necessary and all that kind of thing. And then in 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence, he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which has influenced at least the beginning of this country and its founding. And the concept is that free trade is an invisible hand that regulates itself without the interference of monarchs or governments. And that's classical economic theory. Thorstein Veblen, from 1857 to 1929, his theory of the leisure class contributed the concept of conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is basically getting the nicest thing, let's say the flashiest car, just so that your neighbors will be jealous of you because you have this thing. Same thing with having a nice lawn and so on and so forth. Having a servant particularly is a very conspicuous form of consumption. It makes you look really ritzy and really rich. So that's another thing. Then the theory of business enterprise, which really is sort of about the mechanistic nature of the economy through the actual sort of industrial revolution. Industry is resulting in sort of a mechanistic kind of mentality. Not the machine actually encourages socialism because of the kind of group thought that's created from it, unionism and so forth. It all kind of comes out of that. And then you go up to John Maynard Keynes with his general theory of employment and interest in money. And a quote from that book is that consumption is the sole end and object of all economic activity. That's the sole end and object of our economic activity. So then we go on to Milton Friedman, who was sort of instrumental in the 20th century. His book Capitalism and Freedom, 1962. But also he was just a speaker in general on this topic. So a quote about him is that the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, possibly all of it, by The Economist, in reference to Milton Friedman. And then inflation, a quote by him is that inflation is the one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation. And that's essentially what happened and has happened since 2008. And here's some facts about the Federal Reserve. This isn't on there, but the actual Federal Reserve Act was originally called the Aldrich Act, and it was developed by Nelson Aldrich and basically a grouping of the most elite financial people in the United States and elsewhere at that time. Paul Warburg being one of the more influential people because he was sort of already at the top of the banking industry in the first place. So this is a quote by Paul Warburg, and the matter of a uniform discount rate was discussed and settled at Jekyll Island. And Jekyll Island is an island around Georgia, off the coast of Georgia, that is a country club resort. It's for the wealthy elite to go and duck hunt or whatever. This act was created in secret. They even switched out all of the people who worked there so that they wouldn't know or recognize these people when they were there. So, I mean, clearly there's sort of anything that's done in secret is clearly not in the best interest of everyone if it has to be secret like this. The Federal Reserve Act was passed by an empty Congress on December 21st, when nobody was there at that time. It was basically all of the people who were for this bill were there because they knew that it was being passed, while all the people who really didn't want to see it passed were on vacation for Christmas. And that was passed in 1913. It was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson not very long after, on December 23rd. So the Federal Reserve was established in 19, and it was operational by around 1914. And that same year, you get World War I. which before that time, something like that never existed. World War never even was a concept until that time. And then there was the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1945 after World War II, which makes the dollar basically the reserve currency of the world. And that basically means that we can buy things for a lot. We can buy real, actual things with dollars under the assumption that, under the agreement that the Fed would refrain from overprinting and that the currency was redeemable in gold at $35 an ounce, and that was a flat rate for all of the gold. So that basically means that we could buy capital, real, actual wealth with pieces of paper, which is a pretty big deal in terms of having a global superpower. So August 15th, 1971, because of dissent about can they actually pay up with all the gold? We have a lot of money over here in France or wherever. Are they going to actually be able to pay up? Do they actually have that much gold in reserve to be able to pay us back? So on August 15th, 1971, the Nixon shock happened where he basically temporarily, wink, wink, ended that agreement, suspended the gold convertibility of the U.S. Federal Reserve notes, and essentially ending that Bretton Woods agreement, and that resulted in basically massive land grabs because they had to have some kind of collateral for that money that they were giving to all these countries. So what they did was they bought up massive amounts of land in the United States. That's what's happening right now in Arizona. That's why they're buying up that land, is because they need collateral to pay off the debts that they've incurred on the international scale. And this also has resulted in what's called the petrodollar, which is basically oil and things of that sort being used as a collateral for those dollars as well. And so what is the objective end of this kind of agreement or this kind of a development, especially of this kind of an institution? This kind of institution's main purpose is essentially, and I'm not saying this lightly, the enslavement of the people through an imposed sense of obligation.
This is potentially Lumacorp's most effective instrument for global control. Through international banking, we manipulate the fate of all countries. We have introduced many institutions, such as the IMF and WTO, that work in our favor to impoverish disobedient nations. Always remember, debt is a powerful weapon against countries that don't share Lumacorp's vision.
Perhaps our greatest achievement in banking is the Federal Reserve System. It is a collection of international banks owned by Lumacorp members and financiers. It was created to form a centralized banking system through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, an act that was indeed penned by some of our most esteemed members. Many of you might still assume that the government itself prints and issues the currency. That is not the case. When America needs money, they go to our boys and ask for it. The money is printed, but it is only representative of a loan. Interest accrues on that dollar until it is paid back to the Fed. In fact, the federal taxes paid by the American population go almost entirely to paying off this debt. So you see, Lumacorp derives a healthy amount of its operation funding directly from the debt of the public. Needless to say, this is one of our most crucial sources of funding and one of our proudest achievements here at Lumacorp.
That's the end goal. That is what this thing does. That's what the Federal Reserve is designed to do. And so we have now a quote from Woodrow Wilson about the Federal Reserve System in 1919, and he said, "I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. It has come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." So you don't have to take my word for it. Now, some definitions. First, the Federal Reserve System. And that is, member banks are below the reserve banks in this pyramid of authority with the board of directors at its apex. Now, feudalism is a hierarchical system of power and production, monarch or central bank at the top, and serfs and servants tied to land or the outlets, businesses, what have you, at the bottom. So this is sort of, you can see where I'm getting at here. Basically, we have a pyramid structure system by the Federal Reserve, and that's essentially a form of neo-feudalism. What we have is basically people have been turned into homo economicus, the economic man, a self-interested economic agent. That's all we are, basically, to the economist. And then neo-feudalism, which is basically a rebirth of the concepts that were in place during feudalism in the first place. Basically is unequal rights for legal protections for the common people and nobility. And look what we have today. Is there or is there not an unequal representation by the people versus the aristocrats, basically? Who are the people that have been blamed for the crash of the economy? So were any people actually held accountable for that? So who is actually trying to, who actually has the power in this society? Do we, the people, or is it a small group, is it an oligarchy, essentially, of people? So what we have is the Old Boy Network, which is an exclusive group, often from the same university, who pass information and business opportunities to one another. This is essentially, the Old Boy Network has taken over the government. And it's not very hard to imagine that this would take place. I mean, this is sort of what happens. You get a concentration of financial power into a few people. They know and sort of grow amongst one another, and now you have an oligarchy, an aristocracy. So economism is another word that sort of falls in line with this, which is a taste for material success. We all sort of have a little bit of economism, don't we? We all have sort of this taste for material success. Everybody wants to become a billionaire. Who doesn't? They live very lavishly. And this is essentially why that kind of, that kind of an echelon, that kind of hierarchy exists, is to keep you motivated to perpetuate this system so that you can't think outside of the box and say, maybe this isn't in my best interest, or maybe this isn't the best interest of everyone. Or both. Maybe it's not in my best interest or for the best interest of everyone. Maybe this is just dragging us down and taking us into a dark, dark corner. And so then oligopsony is a market controlled by a few dominant buyers. And the consolidation of these different various corporations is obvious. It doesn't take a genius to recognize that that's what's taking place, and that's what's taken place. And then also an oligopoly, which is a market of industry consisting of a small group, often 5 or less, which is also what's taking place. The consolidation of power. And what we really need is something more like a human scale of economics, which is an economic philosophy based on need, not money. As well as holism, which is basically the perspective that the universe is an interacting whole. There are no separate individual parts, really. They're all always interacting. Everything is interdependent. And that's one of the things that Thorstein Veblen talks about in his theory of business, business enterprise, which is that everything is interconnected. Everything is interdependent. If you take down one industry, it takes down 3 or 4 others simultaneously. So in a way, we have to sort of recognize that these are what we need: human scale economics and holism, rather than really money. Money is anything which is immediately and generally acceptable for the discharge of a debt or in exchange for a good or service. And to be used as a measure of value, money must be expressible in units and stable in value. Now, that's money, okay? Now, what we have to understand is that there's a fundamental difference between money and fiat money, okay? Fiat money is what we use. That's what Federal Reserve notes are. They're legal tenders. So fiat money is anything declared acceptable as money by a central bank or finance ministry in charge of the currency. It is this declaration, rather than its intrinsic value of the money as a good, like silver or gold, which gives it value. Essentially, this is just an arbitrary command that this thing has this value and so forth. So then high-powered money, which is basically the portion of commercial banks' reserves that are maintained in accounts with their central banks plus the total currency circulated. Basically, this is the stuff that they hold in reserve in the bank. reserve currency, and it's also anything that's in circulation. There's a difference between this and the actual general money supply, but it's basically what they have on hand that they can transfer to other people. And what fractional reserve banking does, it's a system using high-powered money, using that same high-powered money as only a fraction of its total assets rather than 100% reserve banking. And what that basically means is that they are able to lend out, let's say, $9 every $10 that they get from somebody. Let's say I put money in the bank, they are lending that out at 10, let's say I put $100 in, they're lending out $90 of that $10 and saying that they basically can, that they have security and that this is creating economic stability. Now, what is the contrast to this, to fractional reserve banking, which, by the way, is what we use today, is 100% reserve banking. What we used to use is 100% reserve banking, and what really any financial elite kind of banker kind of society is not going to like is 100% reserve banking, because it doesn't allow for the kind of really just flagrant use of money that they like to be able to use. And that is, so 100% reserve banking is a banking practice in which the full amount of each depositor's funds are kept in reserve when each depositor has the legal right to withdraw them. That's what we need today. We need a 100% reserve banking policy. But because of the banking elite, we don't really have this, and it's an economyth that that's what's going to destroy our country. There's a fear, there's this myth which is a false economic generalization following a wrong paradigm and based on poor or no empirical research, that a 100% reserve banking economy is going to destroy us somehow. What has the fractional reserve banking done for us? It's lessened the value. If anything, it's caused so much interest and so much credit that we don't know what to do with it. That's really what it's done. And one of the things that really sort of startled me or got me, that always kind of gets me agitated, is the fact that economy, and this is the Rutledge's Dictionary of Economics, 3rd edition, is that economy, the first definition is the market order. Just what it is what we're doing. You want to know a good definition of economy? It's what we're doing. That's what economy is. So that's just sort of an arbitrary definition. And then a set of exchanges, that makes sense. The entry of an economic activities of one nation using the same currency, that kind of makes sense. But really the 4th definition is what I look at as economy. The frugal use of resources in order to minimize costs and maximize efficiency. That's what economy is about. It's household management. That's where the word comes from the Greek econos. It means a household management. And what is this if not our house? The planet is our house. Let's treat it with respect. That's all that was really necessary. Okay, so then there's the money illusion, which is sort of what everybody is experiencing today because of the inflationary period that we're in. It's confusing money values with real values, a phenomenon of inflationary periods. And the money illusion is really important to understand because we're in that time right now. For people it's not very difficult. What makes a $1 bill more valuable than a $100 bill? It's made of the same material, has same ink, just different designs on it. That's all. The illusion, the zeros and the ones are really all that matters at this point in time. So currency is just the official money currently circulating for immediate use. It's a term that's used basically is synonymous with money. It's a medium of exchange. And liquidity is the characteristic of those assets immediately available for the exchange of financial obligations, and the most liquid of that is essentially cash. And we say cash is king, but is cash kind? Does cash have the capability of making a better world, making us more sane as a society? Does it have that ability? No, certainly it does not. And self-sufficient economy. An economy in which the domestic supply and domestic demand are equal for all goods and services. Some U.S. policymakers regard this national state as an optimal goal for the U.S. economy. Now, in terms of long-term goals that we can hope to achieve, okay? We can start by at least putting forward the idea of a benefit-based economy, a benefit-based system. which, or a reciprocal economy, wherein the standard is things like benefit-based corporations or B corporations. And what is a B corporation? A B corporation is a form designed for-profit entities that wish to consider society and the environment in addition to profit in their decision-making process. So it's not just about profit, it's about what people can get out of it. What can the society, it's about the stakeholders instead of the shareholders. And really, the shareholder-stakeholder sort of dilemma is really between greed and what's good. What's greedy and what's good. That's really the kind of contrast that we're seeing here. Do you want to have more money for a very small particular group of people, or do you want to have the society, do you want to improve the conditions for our society? And so that's what we need to do. We need to propose that stakeholders have to become the primary focus, not just shareholders in a far-reaching human-scale form of economy. So the present situation basically is that we have central banks, complex systems, and by that I mean basically the kind of systems that are in place are so complex. High-frequency trading is basically, it's all digital. All of the trades that are going on the stock market are digital, and they're happening at such a fast rate that people can't keep up with it. They don't know what's going on. And in fact, in I think 2010, there was a drastic, massive drop in the economy that since then, nobody can figure out, and what I'm talking about, the quants, the people who have made the algorithms for this form of economy, for the high-frequency trading, don't know what this is about, how that happened to the Dow. There was such a massive drop in the economy. And there are also, at this point, many of the corporations, like Walmart, Starbucks, I mean, just a host of corporations you could probably find on the internet what exactly, which corporations have these kind of tax havens, which are basically places outside of this country or outside of the country whereby these, or Amazon, let's say, is in California. They funnel their money through Ireland, the Netherlands, and various other places, basically to get zero taxes on their profits, which is a very sneaky way of essentially, sitting pretty and not having to actually give back to the society and the community that really made them that successful in the first place. And so this is something that very sort of duplicitous and doesn't need to even be explored much further. So then there's also corporate welfare, which is what happened in 2008 when we bailed out the banks. That's essentially what that is. Corporate welfare is when people prop up the banks. It's a government assurance that these different kind of corporations will be able to continue in perpetuity. So, and then the exploitation of the third world, and that all sort of corporatism, globalism, economic hitman, all those sort of come into one single thing, because the economic hitmen are employed by the globalist corporatist sort of systems to go into a country, exploit its resources. Anybody who doesn't like it will be sort of kicked out. If they democratically elect somebody who doesn't agree with the corporate sort of model, they'll be assassinated by people who are called jackals in their own sort of circles. But economic hitmen go into a place, promise these different things, the economic prosperity, and really what happens is they just end up exploiting all the resources of the country and leave it barren once they've left.
We economic hitmen really have been the ones responsible for creating this first truly global empire. And we work many different ways. But perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan, that they can't repay it. And so at some point, we economic hitmen go back to them and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debts, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Allow us to build a military base in your country, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or vote with us on the next UN vote. To have their electric utility company privatized and their water and sewage system privatized and sold to U.S. corporations or other multinational corporations. So there was that whole mushrooming thing, and it's so typical of the way the IMF and the World Bank work, that you put a country in debt, it's such a big debt it can't pay it, and then you offer to refinance that debt and pay even more interest. And you demand this quid pro quo, which you call a conditionality or good governance, which means basically that they've got to sell off their resources, including many of their social services, their utility companies, their school systems sometimes, their penal systems, their insurance systems, to foreign corporations. So it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy.
And what this all boils down to is basically the New World Order. And there's a lot of people who have different interpretations of what this word means, what this phrase means. George Bush Sr. mentioned it in one of his most famous speeches. It's been used sort of in political circles, maybe not ubiquitously, but very sort of throughout the entire establishment. But to me, I'll give you my interpretation of what this word or phrase really means. In one instance, it's a top-down approach, basically. It's a tyranny of some form. It's a dominance of the few over the many. And that's what a lot of people interpret this to mean, is basically that pyramid with the eye on top of it and all that kind of stuff, the Illuminati and so forth. But really, it could be either that or a bottom-up, which is a democracy, in which case the dominance of the many over the few, which is basically equally bad. That's democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what they're going to have for dinner. See? So that's not the best idea either. What we really need is something more of a merging of both the top-down and the bottom-up, in which case you have a sort of synthesis, a bringing together of two very powerful forces, whereby we can create something that is really sort of like a planetary organism. And what that's kind of characterized as is a mutual respect, collaboration-based society. Collaboration instead of competition. Okay? The whole idea of this being a planetary organism is, imagine if your lungs all of a sudden decided to fight against your heart. What would that result in? You know? What would happen if the cells in your body all of a sudden just decide to do whatever they wanted to do instead of doing what you need them to do to stay alive? And this all goes hand in hand with natural liberty, natural law, and natural rights. But we need to have a renaissance of these ideas. We live in a very much more complex time than when these things were originally created. And so the reason this is that we have this imperative is because all wars are banker wars.
Now, I want to share a story with you, and this is actually an article that I wrote over the weekend called All Wars Are Bankers' Wars. And I went in, I did a lot of research. It's posted to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. I understand it's already gone viral. It's being reposted around the web. And I know a lot of people are going to have difficulty comprehending this. Just how many of these wars we have fought as a nation were fought for no other purpose than to force private central banks onto nations that did not want them. So we're going to have a few examples so you understand why at this particular time in history the United States government is mired in so many wars against so many foreign nations. And there's plenty of precedents for this. Now, going back to the beginning, the United States fought the American Revolution primarily over King George III's Currency Act, which forced the colonists to abandon their own government-issued currencies and conduct business only using printed banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. If you go back to the writings of Ben Franklin, direct quote, the refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the revolution. That's Ben Franklin. Now, our public schools don't teach that because you're not supposed to know that the bankers were really behind the American Revolution. Private bankers are nothing if not dedicated to their schemes to acquire other people's wealth, and they knew full well how easy it is to corrupt a nation's leaders. Now, just 1 year after Mayor Amschel Rothschild had uttered his infamous, "Let me issue and control the nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws," private bankers succeeded in setting up a new private central bank called the First Bank of the United States, largely through the efforts of the Rothschilds' chief supporter in the United States, Alexander Hamilton. Now, this First Bank of the United States was founded in 1791, and by the end of its 20-year charter, the First Bank of the United States had almost ruined the nation's economy while enriching the bank's owners. When the Confederacy seceded from the United States, the bankers once again saw the opportunity for a rich harvest of debt and offered to fund Lincoln's efforts to bring the South back into the Union at 30% interest. Lincoln remarked that he would not free the black man by enslaving the white man to the bankers, and using his authority as president, issued a new government currency, the greenback. This was a direct threat to the wealth and power of the central bankers, who quickly responded. This is a quote from the London Times following Lincoln's issuance of the greenbacks. Quote, "If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." So, goaded by the private bankers, much of Europe supported the Confederacy against the Union, with the expectation that victory over Lincoln would mean the end of the greenback. France and Britain seriously considered an outright invasion on the United States in support of the Confederacy, but they were held at bay by Russia. A little bit of history most Americans don't understand. Russia came to the aid of Lincoln's Union during this crisis. Now, at that time, Russia had just ended their serfdom system, and they had a state central bank similar to the system the United States had been founded on. Now, free of European intervention, the Union won the war, and Lincoln announced his intention to go on issuing the greenbacks. Following Lincoln's assassination, the greenbacks were pulled from circulation and the American people forced to go back to an economy based on banknotes borrowed at interest from the private bankers. So finally, in 1913, the private central bankers of Europe, in particular the Rothschilds of Great Britain, the Warburgs of Germany, met with their American financial collaborators on Jekyll Island, Georgia, to form a new banking cartel with the express purpose of forming the Third Bank of the United States. So 1913 proved to be a transformative year for the nation's economy. First, with Congress' passage of the 16th Income Tax Amendment and the false claim it had been ratified. Here's another direct quote. "I think if you were to go back and try and find and review the ratification for the 16th Amendment, which was the internal revenue, the income tax, I think if you went back and examined that carefully, you would find that a sufficient number of states never ratified that amendment," end quote. That's U.S. District Court Judge James C. Fox in Sullivan versus United States, 2003. Later that same year, 1913, and apparently unwilling to risk another questionable amendment, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act over the Christmas holiday in 1913, while members of Congress opposed to the measure were at home. This was a very underhanded deal, as the Constitution explicitly vests Congress with the authority to issue the public currency, does not authorize its delegation, and thus would have required a new amendment to transfer that authority to a private bank. But pass it, Congress did, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it as he promised the bankers he would in exchange for generous campaign contributions. Now, President Wilson later regretted that decision. You've probably heard this quote before, but you're going to get it again. Quote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." That was Woodrow Wilson writing in 1919. Now, 1 year after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, World War I started, and it is important to remember that prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. Now, World War I actually started between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, but quickly shifted to focus on Germany. Why Germany? They didn't start the war. Why was Germany the villain in World War I? Well, the real reason was their industrial capacity was seen as an economic threat to Great Britain. Great Britain's pound was already in decline at the time because too much economic emphasis was on banking and finance, and not enough was on agricultural development, industrial development, and infrastructure. It's very much like the situation we have in the United States right now. All the financial operatives, they want to play the Wall Street games, and other parts of the economy are being neglected. We've lost a great deal of our manufacturing. We're not the agricultural exporter we used to be because everybody's over there at Wall Street playing in that giant open-air casino. Now, pre-war Germany did have a private central bank, but it was under strict control by the German government to keep inflation at reasonable levels and to make sure that all of the German economy was being properly funded, just like Putin did with their central bank about a month ago. Under government control by the German government, investment was guaranteed to internal economic development, and as a result, Germany had become a major manufacturing technological power. They were exporting products that Great Britain could not compete with. So in the media of the day, Germany was portrayed as the main opponent of World War I. And not just defeated, it was flattened. Now, following the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was ordered to pay the war costs of all the participating nations, even though Germany had not started that war. This amounted to 3 times the value of all of Germany itself. Germany's private central bank, to which the German government had gone deeply into debt to pay the cost of the wars, was allowed to break free of government control. That led to the massive inflation of the Weimar Republic, followed, permanently trapping the German people in endless debt. And money speculators were running rampant, and it led to these situations where you had literally a whole basket full of paper notes to get a loaf of bread. Now, when the Weimar Republic collapsed economically, it opened the door for the National Socialists to take power. Their first financial move was to issue their own state currency, which was not borrowed from private central banks. It was based on a unit of value, not a unit of debt. Freed from having to pay interest on the money in circulation, Germany blossomed and quickly began to rebuild its industry. It was an amazing transformation to see. The media called it the German miracle. Time magazine lionized Hitler for the amazing improvement of life for the German people and the explosion of German industry, and they even named him Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. And then once again, Germany's prosperity and freedom from a private central bank loaning the public currency at interest became a threat to other nations and other powers. I have a couple of quotes here from Winston Churchill that tells you what was really going through the minds of Europe in the years leading up to World War II. Quote, "Should Germany merchandise again," which means do business, "should Germany merchandise again in the next 50 years, we have led this war, World War I, in vain." That was Winston Churchill writing in the Times in 1919. Another quote, "We will force this war upon Hitler if he wants it or not," end quote. Winston Churchill in a 1936 radio broadcast. Quote, "Germany becomes too powerful. We have to crush it," end quote. Winston Churchill in November 1936 speaking to U.S. General Robert Wood. Quote, "This war is an English war, and its goal is the destruction of Germany." Winston Churchill, autumn 1939 broadcast. So it was all about economics and profitability. Now, Germany's state-issued value-based currency was also a direct threat to the wealth and power of the private central banks around the world. And as early as 1933, they started to organize a global boycott against Germany to strangle this upstart ruler who thought he could run his nation without a private central bank. Now, as had been the case in World War I, Great Britain and other nations threatened by Germany's economic power looked for an excuse to go to war. And as public anger in Germany grew over the boycott, Hitler foolishly gave them that excuse. Years later, in a spirit of candor, the real reasons for the war were made clear. Quote, "The war wasn't only about abolishing fascism, but to conquer sales markets. We could have, if we had intended so, prevented this war from breaking out without doing one shot, but we didn't want to." End quote. Winston Churchill to Harry Truman, March 1946.
So all wars are banker wars. So if we are unaware of this fact, we cannot prevent the next crisis from happening. We cannot prevent the next war from happening if we're ignorant of how and why these things occur. And the reason that bankers want war is because of the business and pecuniary interests that supersede the livelihood of the common interest. They supersede the livelihood of us all, and instead, let's make some profits for our shareholders. So some of the original forecasts that turned out to be true about the Federal Reserve is that it promised to bring economic stability. That came out to be wrong, was that it promised to create economic stability. And what it instead did was the exact opposite. It served the old boys club instead of really serving. It actually was true that it was creating economic stability, but not for everyone. It was creating it for the old boy network, basically. So that's really what we need to recognize, is that there has been economic stability for the very tippity top. And if you aren't on that top, well, I have no sympathy for you. So, you're a bum. Okay, so original forecasts, which turned out to be true, was that fractional reserve banking has resulted in more credit. Okay, it has resulted in more credit, but this system has also resulted in less certainty. There's less certainty because there's more credit. And so no energy can be created or destroyed, only transferred. And where has the money, where have the resources been transferred? Yeah, they've been up to that tippity top up there. See? So, and what we can kind of glean from this is that maybe we can create a maxim: the more credit there is, the less certainty. The more credit that's in circulation, the less certainty we have. That is something that we can sort of deduce from this. Okay, so potential alternatives. I have developed some ideas as far as economic alternatives. First one being cloud theory, which I have some copies of that right here. I'm just going to read a few lines from this. Okay. The Cloud Theory of Economics by Matthew P. Holbert. What is happening to economy is what is happening to the nations and people of the world. Evolution of economy is such that it is gradually dissolving into a more pluralistic view. That is to say that economy and governments of the world are democratizing and decentralizing in such a way that a new phase in economic concepts is on the verge of emerging on the planetary scale. In order to clarify this theory, an explanation of the process, historically speaking, is necessary. However, to make this evolutionary process more understandable and make sense to more people, the use of a metaphor is essential. Also, it must be understood that this is an explanation of industrial economy, not of classical mercantile economics. Therefore, we begin with the utilitarian model. Imagine a sphere of ice, whole and unitary. It represents a utilitarian philosophy of capitalist economics. This view is that cold capital, machines, and other raw materials represent value. This can be clearly understood with a cursory examination of history. The iron and steel used to push us into the great industrial age is what we must base the value of our economy upon. This ice-cold sphere of raw material then breaks up into a more globalist mass through centralized banking. The bank, acting as an engine of economic growth, also acted as a ministry of value and an industry whose sole function it was to produce value, to create money, and in a sense to unleash the floodgates. Eventually this flood of credit would drown the lower classes and stand to drown even the middle class in debt. Today, this is consisting of fractional reserve liquidity, with many central banks and their corporations and nation-states dictating the general environment of economics, both exteriorly and interiorly, by way of capital investment and education respectively. This new stage is characterized by a more and more cash and credit-based system that the previous utilitarian model could not use. By doing so, this system relies less and less on cold, hard material for its basis of value, like gold and silver or industrial capital, and the value of money begins to be more and more based on the arbitrary command of central banks. As a consequence of uncertainty due to inflated credit and debased education, the world is heating up, not just literally, but figuratively, and as industry, and more importantly information, make the world more and more global, the tide of conflicts inspired by imperialism and corporate greed begin to rise past the watermark, and the world is also feeling the birth pangs of a new global economy, one which must be more evolved than its current form to handle the demand of democratic systems. The character of this new economy, which will inevitably replace capitalism as an economic premise, will likely bear characteristics of an intangible cloud. Accordingly, As this evolution of our perception of wealth transpires, it appears to have become less solid, less rigid, and more flexible with its liquidity. But as our technology evolves, so too does our economic potentiality. Like ice melting, economy has become far more liquid in recent times, more cash-based, more credit-based, and its abundance and uncertainty has reached a point where the liquid medium of cash has been replaced with more digital currencies, which have been called cloud currency. However, by my definition, this is only a vapor currency, as cloud currency is implied with citizenship, as I will explain below. To sum up the above, where we started with a sphere of ice, we now have a glob of water, which is slowly turning into a gas, which is the beginnings of a forming cloud. This cloud-like form of economy can only be cashless and without restrictions such as taxation and the barriers of rent, loans, dividends, interests, banks, and other such methods of control and usury by financial institutions. In the cloud, the means of exchange is intangible, unquantifiable human will, exercised in the form of labor, goods, services, or ecological and human benefit, and not in the form of a liquidity, cash or money. When our work and respect is shared collectively rather than hoarded individually, we can live without requiring proof of certification that our needs are worth fulfilling. Further, the process of exchange can be instantaneous between individuals because in a democracy, every contributing member, by merit of their requested citizenship and by virtue of their contribution to society at every varying degree of their contribution, will make them capable of simply walking into a store and taking what they need, such as foodstuffs, clothing, and available shelter as an earned right. However, luxury goods will be limited to a person's contributing value to a society as a privilege. Further, the profit motive, by virtue of this new dimensionality to economy, must be reversed into the direction of getting an equal measure to what you give, rather than getting more than you give, which is the commonly understood impetus of the current definition of profit motive. The author calls this a reciprocal economy, because of the reciprocal nature of the economic driver, which is the essential foundation of all economy, human will. Notice, however, that a cloud-like economy has elements of both capitalism and socialism, but does not have the power or potential for the top-down approach of either. It can and must be a grassroots approach, bottom-up approach, because as water or liquidity evaporates, so too the bonds that have kept the mass of human will together break down from monarchy to republic to democracy. What we are experiencing with this kind of flow from rigid solidity to liquid flexibility to gaseous intangibility is the development of a broader consciousness that is far headier and more evidently fractal in nature than the previous forms. Also, just as the cloud can more effectively allocate its liquidity to the surface of the earth than a ball of ice or glob of water, this new economic structure, transcending and including the previous forms, will have characteristics of holism, human-scale economics, and economic self-sufficiency due to its inherent grassroots scale. Bear in mind, however, that this cloud cannot stay in the sky forever. It must be balanced by first condensing into globs, then falling, turning into ice, then globs of water again, and ultimately returning to the earth at semi-regular intervals for the cycle to be completed and to keep the cycle of wealth and resources recirculating. The following is an explanation of the process of how this cloud-like economy will function. But it must be understood that this is only a simple projection because every local area must come up with their own model. I feel it should be left up to the future democracies to better develop and organize this method. Starting as a cloud of individual droplets of human will or the aggregate society or local community, and further condensing those individual droplets into globs of human will in the form of resource councils or test groups. The beginning of this cycle will occur in the form of stakeholder councils, or what has been called wisdom councils, by a man named Jim Ruff, where products, services, and acts of benefit will be evaluated, and cold capital resources will then be administered from that group of randomly selected people, much like product test groups, wherein the purpose of these groups is to evaluate and assign a value to products, goods, services, and certain ecological or human benefit created by a person. The products that fall under certain categories of goods will therefore be evaluated by licensing corporations as they function today. And finally, the people themselves to determine if they are worth investing in the next quarter. Such groups will evaluate and expect to administer resources for products that they unanimously decide are fit for production, much like a product test group or a trial phase of invention and production. And then after 4 months, these groups will disperse and a new group will be randomly selected. In the cycle mentioned above, the transfer of energy or currency or capital goes thus. Collective society, the cloud, differentiated group or wisdom council is a glob of water, and allocated capital, like an ice crystal, is then what is distributed through businesses, jobs, and labor working that capital into production, which is another glob of water. And once a product reaches consumers, it has reached the collective society, and it is left up to the collective will of that society, and therefore returns to the ocean or cloud, depending upon which way you wake up in the bed that morning. So, in this way, each time a group is brought together, they are like a small glob of human will out of the cloud, which is the aggregate economy, composed only of the essence of all economic principles, human will, and the feedback loop between production and consumption in a human scale of economics. And with every drop of resources allocated, these wisdom councils are keeping the cycle of life, wealth, and the feedback loop between production and consumption in a human scale economics. It is possible that these groups or councils could become themselves differentiated and that they may become specific to a field such as art, engineering, food, education, entertainment, news media, design, fashion, transportation, science, etc. And by having people who are specifically interested in a field of evaluation, there is a greater potential for a more meritocratic form of councils than simply random selection. However, this is a stipulation that can come about organically or by written constitution. What is most important is that people have control over their goods and services rather than a Wall Street market that has gotten more and more out of control and more uncertain. If wisdom is defined as seeing beyond immediate appearances and acting with a greater understanding to affirm the life and development of all, as Tom Atlee describes in The Tao of Democracy, then perspective offers wisdom. Therefore, communities have greater potential for wisdom than do individuals. Communities are wise, he explains further, to the extent that they use diversity well in cooperative, creative interplay of viewpoints that allows the wisest, most comprehensive, and powerful truths to emerge. Using co-intelligence, described by Atlee as integrating the diverse gifts of all for the benefit of all, and a technique called dynamic facilitation to replace mutual stuckness with common wisdom, described by business consultant Jim Ruff, author of Society's Breakthrough, Releasing Essential Wisdom and Virtue in All the People. We might have the tools necessary to evolve the founder's revolutionary vision and step into the 21st century with a collaboration-based system rooted in interdependence and mutual respect. According to Ruff, dynamic facilitation can provide a non-judgmental, heartfelt, energy-driven, creative thinking process in which the people seek to invent new options that work for everyone. Instead of negotiating agreement
on particular points or discussing ideas back and forth, people seek breakthroughs everyone can support. To quote Bruce H. Lipton, PhD, in his book Spontaneous Evolution, in regards to such councils making governmental decisions and perhaps just as easily resource management decisions, quote, while such councils have the inferred power of moral authority and could recommend new solutions to the public, they do not possess coercive powers associated with the authority to pass legislation. And further, that regardless of the level of government or community in which they are used, such councils and their evolutionary principles offer society a vision of what is a healed body politic. While I am sure that most economists reading this fail to understand the implication, connection, and relevance of the above quotations and names which I have invoked, seeing as how these men are not economists and not members of the Old Boy Network, it is for this very reason that these voices are so important, necessary in our time. It was Einstein who said, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking when we created them."
Okay, which basically cloud theory is just it's an evolution. It's under the premise that there's an evolution of economy. As I went through before, there was the stages of economy from barter to money to basically regulation of money to banking. And what we're seeing now through things like Bitcoin and so forth is sort of a digitization, a sort of return almost to bartering, where it's basically you're creating a gas. You're creating an intangible form of currency, which in and of itself is sort of like the vapor that is rising into the cloud. And what the cloud is basically just, it's a direct sort of exchange process. If I'm a working person in society, I get just a universal basic income. But also, that universal basic income is coming from the aggregate. From the individual, I can receive services, goods, and so forth that are just, it's just basically just, hey, you're a citizen? Oh, okay, what money is essentially, are you a contributing member of society? Yes, and here are the bills to show it, see? What this is doing is removing that necessity, that middleman. If I'm a citizen at all, I don't need that currency to have to exchange with. That's cutting out the middleman essentially, and what that does. Now, granted, we can't have this kind of system be practical in the kind of culture that has been ingrained into us today. It takes a shift in our consciousness, a shift in our understanding of how we should behave, a shift in the culture for us to be able to even be mature enough to handle this kind of an alternative. And I'm calling this the next stage in the evolution of economics. I'm not saying that we should do this, have a riot tomorrow and just have this implemented. It wouldn't be that simple. We need to evolve ourselves to be able to have this kind of a system be possible. To have flexibility in any system is essential. So that's another thing is, this idea is sort of wiggle room to sort of evolve and make new things. So also, this is all on the human scale, local market kind of scale. It's not something that has a federal implementation from the very top telling you what is valuable and what's not. It's all localized. All of the values for all the products are going to be local to that economy. And the forecast of the costs for what this kind of alternative will mean is that there will be no taxation, there will be no debt, there will be no credit, there will be really no institutionalized forms of sort of money, as it were, and a wealth reduction for the few thousand billionaires on the planet, but otherwise, and also a minor industrial loss, because industry will sort of, it's already sort of going there, at least in this country. We don't really have as much industry as we had anyway, but there will be industrial sort of declines that result from that. And so I'm going to go over the cloud theory in a nutshell, which is that It means a new level of economics is evincing itself.
What do you desire? What makes you itch? What sort of a situation would you like? Let's suppose, I do this often in vocational guidance of students. They come to me and say, well, we're getting out of college and we haven't the faintest idea what we want to do. So I always ask the question, what would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life? Well, it's so amazing. As a result of our kind of educational system, crowds of students say, well, we'd like to be painters, we'd like to be poets, we'd like to be writers, but as everybody knows, you can't earn any money that way. Or another person says, well, I'd like to live an out-of-doors life and ride horses. I say, do you want to teach in a riding school? Let's go through with it. What do you want to do? When we finally got down to something which the individual says he really wants to do, I will say to him, you do that. And forget the money. Because if you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like doing in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing, which is stupid. Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way. In the West, we inherit the idea of law from those ancient conceptions of God, and it is even passed down into science, where we discuss laws of nature. But one recognizes more and more in the sciences that what we call laws of nature are simply observed regularities in the way things behave. And you, in order to observe regularities, you must look at things through something regular. That is to say, you must lay a ruler alongside them, or compare their behavior with the regular behavior of a clock. But clocks and rulers are human inventions. They are regular measures which we use for comparing the rates of change. Say, a clock is a measure of a rate of change. It's quite arbitrary. But we very easily compare our regulation measuring devices with what makes things happen, as if the sun rises because it's 6 in the morning. Now that's being completely backwards in one's thinking. And we get into the same confusion when we imagine, for example, that money is wealth. Here we have fantastic wealth, you know, and we have the technological possibility of making everybody on earth the enjoyer of an independent income. We can't do it because people say, where's the money going to come from? Because they think money makes prosperity. It's the other way around. It's physical prosperity which has money as a way of measuring it. But people think money has to come from somewhere, like hydroelectric power or lumber or iron, and it doesn't. Money is something we invent, like inches. So you remember the Great Depression? When there was a slump? And what did we have a slump of? Money. There was no less wealth, no less energy, no less raw materials than there were before, but it's like you came to work on building a house one day, and they said, sorry, you can't build this house today, no inches. What do you mean, no inches? Just inches. We don't mean we got inches of lumber, yes, we've got inches of metal, we've even got tape measures. But there's a slump in inches as such, you see. And people are that crazy. They can have a depression because they've got no inches to go around, or no dollars. It's all a lot of nonsense. But you see, because we get thinking backwards, making the metaphysical tail wag the dog, making the law rule things, whereas it doesn't. It's merely a way of measuring what happens. There's a new form of economy that's developing out of our digital age and so forth. That new level is sort of an intangible cloud. It is an economy based on, well, the human scale of economics, need, not money,
what are our needs, what do we want, instead of the, how can we get it.
Anybody who tries to reestablish human connections, reskill themselves and other people, learn to do things without buying them, then you're a degrowth activist. I'm also a degrowth theorist because I describe what money systems and social structures would work in a degrowth context. The disaster that we've created of the world has come through, or despite, all of our best planning and logic and technological solutions and linear thinking. And it's time that we start listening to something else. A real community is a gift economy where you can help your neighbor or help somebody in the community, give something to them, and they don't pay you, but they feel gratitude towards you. So they want to do something for you too. They want to take care of you too. Or even if they have nothing to give to you, somebody else in the community sees that you're being generous. And so the community takes care of you. And if you're not generous, if you're really selfish, then no one wants to take care of you either. So in a gift culture, the more you give, the richer you are, which is kind of the opposite of a money culture. There are ways that people can create connections that don't depend on money. They can do it through the internet, things like time banking, LETS currencies, mutual exchange currencies. In some American cities now, there are car sharing programs where you don't have to own your own car, but there's these kind of public cars, and you just pay for whenever you want to use them. So they're being shared. Every family doesn't need to have its own set of power tools. You just have one or two sets for the whole neighborhood in a big shed. And everybody is just as well off as before, but actually it's bad for the economy in traditional terms, because now you don't have to buy so many sets of power tools. In my ideal world, work becomes a matter of the expression of our gifts, motivated by passion, called forth by the needs, and not coerced by money. And today it's kind of ironic. Money is supposed to be society's, the representation of society's gratitude for your contribution. But weirdly enough, today the things where there's the most money, the professions that give the most money, aren't the ones that are contributing the most to society and the planet. You can make a lot of money by doing terrible things. And the things that we need to do the most, there's not much money in those.
What could I possibly do that will be enough? I'm just one person. And in this, and even if I make the right choices, there's millions, hundreds of millions of other people who are mindlessly consuming. And my choices aren't going to necessarily affect them. And maybe if I have a big pulpit, maybe if I write a book and speak to millions, maybe then I'll have an effect. But what about the powers that be who control the media? And basically it's the same mindset that the small things that I do couldn't possibly make a difference. Yet we have this feeling that Stefana said, this more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. Our hearts know it's possible. I'm sure you've had that feeling many times here today. But our minds do not know that it's possible. Our minds cannot see how to get from here to there. Because our understanding of causality even doesn't allow for a path from here to there. For this more beautiful world to actually manifest, miracles would have to happen. Which is why I've become interested in miracles, which are not the intercession of an external divine agency in violation of the laws of nature. Miracles are something that are impossible from an old understanding of reality and possible from a new one.
It is not a tangible resource. Money is not actually a tangible resource. It represents an intangible resource, which is human productive will. And when you reduce the economy down to just the bare essentials of human productive will, and the actual act of labor is the first half of the exchange process, whereby if I have a job, basically I can just go into a place and get whatever I want, That is essentially what I'm talking about. It takes out the middleman. It boils it down to its essential basis. You know, one of the things that I came up with an idea as far as like how we could demonstrate this is a million-man march on New York City. With everybody who attends this has to have a $1 bill. That's the one condition. And they're not going to pay anybody. What they're going to do is they're going to go to the Federal Reserve in New York and burn the dollar that they have in front of the Federal Reserve and stand there with the burning dollar and let it get to maybe half of the dollar or something and drop it and just leave. No protest, no form of rioting of any kind. Do that and leave. That's it. That kind of an action is symbolic. It's also sort of getting back in the system. So educate others, turn off the television. And you can do it right now, I don't care. Turn off the television. Talking to you, okay? Talking to you out there in TV land. And put your hands in the soil. Put your hands into the soil. Put your eyes into a book and put your heart into the lives of your fellow human beings. My God, our lives have been trivialized by this propaganda society culture that has lorded over top of us for many decades. Get involved. Be the change that you want to see. Be the change. That's the only way it's going to happen. You know, you can expect there's going to be this riot outside your door, this revolution that's going to happen over there, and you're going to go join it. But that's not what's going to happen. You are the revolution. You have to first become the person with the pitchfork and torch before this kind of thing is actually going to happen. Now, granted, I don't think that the pitchfork and torch kind of revolution is what we should have. I think we should have an evolution, not a revolution. It takes consciousness, not aggression, to create change. And so, however, there is a book that you can read that will help you in this process called From Dictatorship to Democracy by a man named Gene Sharp. And yeah, get mad. Stand up against usury and economic dictatorship. Knowledge is power, truth is freedom, and wisdom lasts. So, does anybody have questions or anything that they would particularly like to mention before we start this? Sure.
I have a question about reciprocism.
Okay.
How does it work with people who are unable to participate, for instance, handicapped or mentally?
Anybody who's meant to okay, so to repeat the question, how does a person who is handicapped, mentally retarded, somebody who's basically incapable of doing something, disabled, whatever, get money or get some kind of a benefit from this system? And this is sort of a idea really of sort of moral implications, which is that a person who can't contribute, let's say a child who's born mentally retarded, okay, they are automatically born with a job, with a purpose, with a meaning in our society, which is that they cause us to not take for granted what we would otherwise take for granted, okay? The fact that we have our mental faculties and so forth, and those resources or the sort of money in this economy would be allocated to the parents until that child can sign their name on a card. If that child can never sign their name on a card because they're so extremely mentally retarded in some way, shape, or form, then they will essentially always have that benefit go to the parents so that the parents can take care of them, ideally. And you could also transfer that to maybe like a home and have that sort of the resources basically allocated to that. Anybody who has, let's say, maybe it was on the job or whatever, let's say a huge hammer, it hits their head and they end up becoming mentally retarded by subsequent outside influence, they would still be able to get this kind of benefit. Now, great, if it ends up being somebody who doesn't have any family or something of that sort, those things can be figured out. But essentially the idea is that by having a disability, by having whatever, your allocated resources based on the severity of that. And we can categorize that, these are all things that sort of have already been done for us. There's, severely, mild, a fraction of a percent sort of mentally retarded or whatever. So these kind of things can be, the level of the resources depends on the severity of the, case, I guess you could say. Now, as far as getting into old age and things like that, I mean, you've done enough. If you've been a contributing member of society for long enough, screw it. The whole point of this is that there's wiggle room. This is a human scale economic system, okay? So even if you're not a contributing member, you can still live in the society and people won't throw rocks at you. So that's just my idea for it. Now, obviously, this is the thing. I'm just one person. I've come up with these ideas by myself, okay? So you have to give me some leeway in the fact that, like, okay, I don't, maybe there's better ways to do this, okay? But I'm not aware of them yet. So that's my version of a solution, at least as far as that's concerned. So I hope, did that answer your question? System too.
So I wanted to clarify some of my understanding of like your idea of an alternative, and then maybe possible ways to start implementing that on a small scale, as far as like kind of breaking away from this bigger structure and trying to start a new alternative in a smaller community and branch out from that. So my understanding is that with this system, all of your basic life needs are met with citizenship. And how is citizenship granted?
You request it.
You request it. Do you have to like take a test or something?
No, there's no test. You just request.
Just kind of like I want to be a citizen. Okay.
And you can also opt out of it at any time as well. There's a freedom of opting in and out of this system.
So all the basic needs of life are met. However, any kind of conveniences, like having an iPhone or whatever, like stuff that you don't need to survive, I guess.
Right.
Or like having like, I guess, your own personalized things.
Right.
Would be based on your level of contribution to the overall society, and whatever you contribute is kind of sent through like a database where people vote on, I like this, or nah, I don't like that so much. And the stuff that gets the more votes to it, who determines how much resources you get and what resources you get? Is it kind of just like, I earned like this resource through the amount of credits that I accrued through people voting for my thing, and now I can pick from this option of stuff for conveniences? Or
I mean, that aspect of it
technology would be the center, like the judger, or what?
I would prefer for it to be a human scale sort of system where it's all determined by human beings, not a computer. That should be determined by the local area, really. Who decides?
So they can all set it up differently.
Everywhere can set it up differently, but everywhere has to have a central thread that really is like the fact that you're not having a formal money system basically in these areas. That's the only thing that has to be assured, is that there isn't a form of currency being distributed by the government. You can distribute it amongst yourselves, but not by the government.
So then the form of currency could be used in the way of exchanging for conveniences as opposed to like survival?
Right.
Some people say this song I wrote is very naive.
And after all, if you do really like what you're doing, it doesn't matter what it is, you can eventually turn it, you could eventually become a master of it. The only way to become a master of something is to be really with it. And then you'll be able to get a good fee for whatever it is. So don't worry too much. Somebody's interested in everything. And anything you can be interested in, you'll find others who are. But it's absolutely stupid to spend your time doing things you don't like in order to go on spending things you don't like and doing things you don't like, and to teach your children to follow in the same track. See, what we're doing is we're bringing up children and educating them to live the same sort of lives we're living, in order that they may justify themselves and find satisfaction in life by bringing up their children, to bring up their children to do the same thing, so it's all retch and no vomit. It never gets there. And so, therefore, it's so important to consider this question. What do I desire?